And for more on Apple's prospects in China, we're joined by Evan Yu. He's the Senior Technology Specialist at financial services company, the Motley Fool. Evan, thanks for joining us. Good to see you.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So, Evan, Apple took a hit on Tuesday in reaction to news of the People's Bank of China's 2% devaluation of the renminbi. Apple tanked 5%. It did make a slight recovery on Wednesday, perhaps people seeing it as a buying opportunity. Closed marginally in the red, more or less flat today. Evan, is this mostly because a weaker yuan means less revenue when the currency is converted back into US dollars?
Absolutely. I mean, I still think that the sell-off was a bit of an overreaction to the news. Apple, like all multinational companies, has been facing, FX headwinds all year as the dollar's been strengthening against pretty much all currencies. So they're very aware of how challenging the FX environment is out there. Apple, like other companies, uses a lot of hedges and currency hedges to kind of mitigate that effect. So, I think that the overall effect will be manageable. It's definitely a big headwind and a risk factor, but I think investors need to be careful not to overweight it relative to the overall growth opportunities that they have.
Evan, I take your point that Apple and other multinationals hedge against big currency fluctuations in their big markets. But came as a big surprise. Nobody saw this one coming, though.
Yeah, it definitely caught everyone off guard. So I could definitely see Apple and other companies taking a hit in the short term if they have a large presence in China. But I think investors should really look at the longer term picture, because in the long term, Apple and other companies can kind of adjust their hedges based on what they think the market expectations are. So if they have a different picture of what the yuan is going to do, they can factor that into their hedging strategy. So a short term hit is definitely possible, but I think long term they'll be okay.
But there is the bigger concern that the devaluation signals bigger problems in the Chinese economy, that it's a symptom. And China is Apple's second biggest source of revenue after the Americas. In its latest report, China made up to $13.2 billion of Apple's revenue. And what was significant was that was up 112% from the same quarter of last year. And as we know, CEO Tim Cook has said he expects China to become Apple's biggest market at some point. So can Apple still expect this kind of growth momentum out of China?
I think that they can. There are a lot of risks for doing business in China, and I think the currency is certainly a big one, and it's more prominent now that after the news. But if you look at the growth where they've been coming from, right now the China business is about 2/3 the size of the U.S. business. Now, if we go back 2 years, the U.S. business was 2.5 times as big. So, you can see how much they're growing, and it's really catching up in a really meaningful way. And on an annual basis, they were up 70% last year. And, compare this to a market like Japan, for example. Apple's doing about $15 billion in revenue there. It's about flat over the past couple of years, but China's now at $50+ billion, and is growing very, very nicely. So I think before long, Tim Cook will prove that he's right, and it probably will become the #1 market for them.
All right, well, let's focus on the yuan again. And on the flip side, a cheaper yuan, Apple could benefit from lower production and manufacturing costs in China. Do you think that Apple could then use that to lower the price of Apple products in China and perhaps abroad as well?
I don't think they would use that to lower prices. I think if they, you're right that they might be able to have some benefits in terms of component costs, which would also scale across their entire business because they make all iPhones in China. So if they get some favorable impact on the cost side, that actually helps their business globally as well. But I don't think they would turn around necessarily to pass that savings on to consumers, because it's not really Apple's strategy necessarily. They like to stay in the premium high end, and maybe it would help offset any headwinds they face on the sales side in China. So I think that's how they would probably play it.
Well, what about the fact that Apple may need to revisit its pricing strategy in general in China, because it's losing market share to Xiaomi and Huawei rather, and they'll be able to be less expensive and perhaps get more market share with a weaker yuan. Do you see Apple still maintaining its stronghold in China? Do you think that the Chinese appetite for American brands will override the price differences?
We'll have to see, because Apple tries very, very hard not to harmonize prices across geographies mid-product cycle. So they're going to try their best to not increase prices, because clearly if you increase prices, that can hurt unit demand. So you really don't want to do that unless you absolutely have to. They did that in Russia last year, but that was kind of a crazy situation. They actually rose prices by 70% in a month, but the ruble was down like 20% in a week. So kind of unheard of volatility there. I don't think we're going to see that level of volatility here. The yuan's down, 2-3% or so. So I think overall they're going to try very hard not to raise prices. So I think it's unlikely, but it's hard to call for sure right now.
All right, thanks so much, Evan.